JHipster is an application generator that creates a Spring Boot application on the back end and an AngularJS application on the front end. It also includes Bootstrap to make everything look good. This is a demonstration of JHipster, and in this demonstration we'll generate a basic blog application, take a look at its configuration of the files that are created by default, and then we'll generate some CRUD entities to have a blog application, and we'll limit the blogs by the current user, allow some HTML, and basically improve the UI a bit. And then we'll deploy it to Heroku, all in 20 minutes. This is what the entity diagram looks like. We have a user that's provided by JHipster, a blog with a name and a handle, an entry that has the blog entries, and tags. To create a new JHipster project, you need npm, yeoman, and bower installed before you start. I already have all those installed, so I can just create a new directory called blog, cd into it, and run yo JHipster. I'm going to choose a monolithic application just because it's a default, but you notice that microservices are also supported. We're going to call it blog, use the default package name. For authentication, we can use OAuth2 or JWT, but I'm just going to use the default HTTP session. I'll use a SQL database. And production, we'll use MySQL, H2 in development, cache. I do like Elasticsearch, so I'll include that. We're not going to do clustered HTTP sessions, not going to use WebSockets. I'm going to be hip and use Gradle, no SAS, and yes, Angular Translate. So that's going to start creating a project for me and running npm to install all the dependencies. If we look in that project, we can see that it has about 11,000 lines of code just to start, and it's got JavaScript and Java, mostly, with more Java than JavaScript. So if we open this up in IntelliJ, first thing we'll do is configure it so we make sure it's running under Java 8. And we can make it a little bit bigger. So if you're familiar with Spring Boot, you'll be familiar with the application.java file, or the basic meat of Spring Boot, as well as the application web.xml, which is Spring Boot Servlet Initializer. You'll also notice at the top of my screen here it says editor config is overriding code style settings for this file. That's because there's this handy little editor config file that comes with Spring Boot that tells it that you want to use spacing and indent styles, as well as change it for certain different files. So I love having that and having my IDE just configured for me right out of the box. If we go back to application file, this is where it initializes Spring Boot, has some Spring profiles that get kicked in or read from, and makes everything work. And of course there's a number of configuration files for the database, for Elasticsearch, for Jackson, for logging aspects. If you're familiar with Spring Security, you might be familiar with the security configuration file that implements CSRF, configures Remember Me, form-based authentication, and login, logout. There's also the web configurer that configures caching HTTP headers, static resources for production, and basically optimizes the whole front end. And then under web are all the REST endpoints for account registration, as well as activating and authenticating, and the user API as well. Then under the web app directory is where all the JavaScript files are, the entry point for Angular, app.config, and app.module configures all the Angular dependencies, and basically makes everything work nicely with Spring Security and the REST API. Under the resources directory There's configuration for doing liquid base, which creates all your tables for you. Under this changelog directory, you can see the initial schema that gets created for the default usernames, passwords, things of that sort. Users.csv has all that information, as well as the authorities and who has those authorities. So our application is finished installing npm and installing all those dependencies. Took a couple minutes to do, but not too bad. So now if we want to start it, we can use Gradle w boot run. If we look at it in a browser, you can sign in with either admin or user. This is just showing you some of its features. It's got user management built in. You can edit those users, change the information if you want to. There's also metrics. So Spring Boot provides a number of health metrics about the application and how it's doing, and what the timing numbers are like. This is showing all that in a nice UI. There's also health to make sure email, you have enough disk space, database is up, all that kind of stuff. Configuration from Spring Boot, it reads this and displays it, as well as auditing, logging, where you can even tweak the logs. For instance, you could change Spring Framework to be debug. And Swagger documentation of the API. This is only enabled in development, so in production people wouldn't be able to see this. And of course you could even switch the language and switch it back. There are no entities, so let's create some. You do this with JHipster entity. We'll start with a blog entity. And we do want to add a field. We want to add a name field. And we want to validate that it's there. And then we're going to add a handle. No more fields, but we would like a relationship with user. And we'll make this many to one. We'll show the user's login information. And then we want to add a relationship with entry. This will be one to many. And then you can use a DTO if you want to have a wrapper around your entities. I'm not going to. You can also use a separate service class. I'm not going to. And then we don't have that many blogs, or I don't plan on having that many blogs, so I'm not going to use any pagination. We'll overwrite that master liquid base file because we are adding a new entry for creating the blog table. You can see here it created only a few Java files, but a whole bunch of HTML and JavaScript files for the Angular front end, as well as information or internationalization for the text strings. Now we'll create one for tag. We'll add a name field. We'll give it a minimum length of 2. No more fields, but we do have relationships. We have relationships with entry, many to many. And we're not the owner. No more relationships. We'll use the entity directly, use the repository directly, and we'll use infinite scroll. Then lastly, we'll have entry. We'll start with the title, make it required, content field, and we'll go ahead and make this a clob since there might be lots of text in there. We'll make that required, and then we'll have a date. We'll use the zone date time from the Java 8 API for that. Make that required as well. No more fields. We do want a relationship with blog, and that is a many to one. We'll show the blog's name. And then we want to show tags. That's many to many, and we are the owner, and we'll show the name there as well. No DTO, no service class, infinite scroll. Okay. So now if we look at our liquid-based files, you'll see here we have a bunch of new ones for creating those tables. As well as under entities, we have our whole UI that's been created. And we have an entry resource and a blog resource. So it generated all those files for us. Pretty nice. Now we'll start it up again. I'm also going to start Gulp. Gulp runs a browser sync option in your browser that basically allows any HTML, CSS, JavaScript, when any of that changes, it refreshes your browser automatically for you. So it's a pretty handy tool to use. So we'll log in as an administrator. We'll go ahead and look at our entities. We'll create a new blog called Admin's Blog. And we'll create a user's blog. Now we'll create some tags. We'll create some entries. And one more. Okay, so you can see that one of the problems we have now is that from a security perspective, I can go in and modify anyone's blog. So we want to fix that. Let's change this blog screen so it only shows ones that I have permission to see. So if we go back to the blog resource, there's this blog repository find all. If we change that to find by user as current user, then it'll only get the current user's information or their blogs. And this has already been created for us. This was generated by JHipster. So you can see here it does that limiting for us. So if we go back, recompile, you'll notice in the background here, it's actually restarted our whole application for us. And that's a feature of Spring Boot's DevTools that basically allows you to just recompile your classes, and it picks those up and knows that things have been improved. So now if we log in as a user, we'll only see the user's information. Not entries, but for blogs. So that's working. Now we want to do it for entries as well. So if we go into the entry resource, there's a similar find all, and we're going to change this to find by blog user login order by date descending, and we'll pass in security utils get current user login. That's provided by JHipster, and now we can generate this method in our repository. And Spring JPA is smart enough to know that it should actually create a query that matches what this method name is. So we can compile that one. Compile this one. Spring Boot restarted. And now we're limiting those as well. So another thing I wanted to do was make HTML work in the view. You'll notice right now if I was to go in here and say I love JavaScript in bold, you'll notice it doesn't get processed. So in this table we can change entry content to basically allow HTML using ng-bind HTML. Now you notice there's nothing there. If we look at our developer tools, you'll notice that there is an error from Angular. And that's because Angular requires ng-sanitize to be in your class path per se, or your dependencies, for it to safely process HTML. Mostly because it tries to protect you from cross-site scripting. So app module.js has our list of Angular dependencies, and we can add ng-sanitize. Now it's working. So pretty slick. Now let's change from using the table to a more blog-like format. So we'll take this out. Now it looks more like a blog, and we can still edit everything if we want to. So let's get this thing deployed to Heroku. You do that with yo JHipster Heroku. We'll deploy it as JHipster demo in the US region. This automatically detects what database we're using, so since we're using MySQL, it'll install an add-on for MySQL for Heroku. If we're using Postgres, it would handle that as well. And this basically builds your front-end application that's been completely optimized by concatenating all your JavaScript files together, by doing minification on CSS and JavaScript, and even minifying images like you can see there. So it took about 45 seconds to generate the application. Now it's uploading it to Heroku. And you'll notice we can use Heroku logs tail to see what's happening on the server. Make it a little easier to read. You can see there's some Elasticsearch that failed to start right here. Well, that's because of the configuration. If we were to go into application dev and grab that default configuration and put it in for prod, then when we redeploy it, we'll fix that. So that's just a workaround for Heroku, but it's not going to affect any behavior. So now if we go back here, we do Heroku open. There we are. We can log in, and it all works. We have all our entities. There's no data, but that's because it initialized a new database. So If you have any questions about JHipster, we invite you to, first of all, go to the website, read the documentation there. There's also the JHipster mini book, which is available for free from InfoQ, and Stack Overflow. We encourage you to ask any questions that you might have on Stack Overflow with the JHipster tag.